I wanted to start with growing up. So growing up, I was born into a family of 4. So my siblings, you see them right there, my brothers are big guys, very athletic. My sister was probably about 15 years older than me, so I really don't remember her being at home. I certainly remember my brothers. They were very and are very dominating. And so in order for me to have a voice in the house, I had to be very aggressive. If I wanted to eat, before they ate my food off my plate, I had to eat quick. So I really was raised in that environment of, you know, I have to be a strong female in order for myself to be heard. Growing up, my dad was also a principal, and I hated school. Absolutely hated school. I did everything I possibly could to not go to school. And I hated school because my dad was the principal, and we lived in a small town, and if a teacher was mad, they took it out on me. If a kid was mad at my dad, they took it out on me. And so really growing up, the only people that understood that were my brothers, because they had been through it. And so that formed a really strong bond between myself and my brothers. And as you can see down at the bottom, this is my son, and then this is our whole family, and our family functions are big and loud all the time. So at about age 12, I fell in love with volleyball. And volleyball was where I felt like I belonged. For the first time, I played year-round on a club volleyball team, and they were not kids that went to my school. They didn't know my dad. It was my own group of friends, and I felt like I belonged. I spent day and night in the gym. I lived and breathed volleyball, clear up through high school. And so around probably my sophomore, junior year, I was heavily recruited for volleyball, Division I, and I was scared to death to go away and leave the comfort of my family and the home. And so I wrote it out, pretending like I was gonna go on visitations and just stalling. And at some point, my senior year, I had to tell everyone I'm not gonna take a volleyball scholarship. And at that point, I knew I will never, it's the biggest regret I have in my entire life, I will never let fear stop me from pursuing something that I really love. So that's why I'm here, because I've wanted to come to the Midwest, and Ames was the perfect fit for me. So then I faced my biggest challenge. I got to parent 2 kids as a single mom. And they are strong-willed. So my daughter has been probably my biggest challenge. She is very messy, very stubborn, strong-willed, and she went her own path. She loved volleyball, played volleyball, but loved animals. And so I would come home from work, where I worked long hours, and my son would come up and say, "Mom, Shelby's got more chickens in her room." And she would, and literally she would have baby chicks, she'd raise them in her room. I'd look on Facebook and notice that there was pictures, and I could tell it was her floor, and there was cats. And so she had this passion for animals, and we were not an animal family. So she did this all on her own. And then my son was completely opposite, very much OCD, and very kind, always wanting to please. And so Shelby'd bark at him, and he'd give in to her, and then we'd have this vicious cycle. And they were only 19 months apart, and it was just this constant chaos. But somehow they came out okay, or I think they did. And just that world of, some of you know, being a single mom and not having a support system was really difficult, and that led me to look at people differently. I came from a home that had a mom and a dad that provided for us, and I never worried about finances, or I always knew I had rights. Well, my kids grew up in a world where I had to work, and I had to arrange for rides, and there were many times that I forgot them, and they made calls to my secretary or whoever, and so the resilience that they have from that experience, I think, is really important. And I see that in kids today as well. Those are just some more pictures. That's Shelby, and that's Radley. And so we have this bond that's amazing. I show this picture because this was my first graduating class as a superintendent. So I'm like kind of right there tucked in the middle. And I did this every year. And yes, it's a much smaller senior class than what we would have here. But one of my goals is really to be involved and to know our kids as much as possible. And so I show this picture because my kids growing up, this was their world. They had to go with me to every event. They had to go to dances, go to games. I didn't have anybody to watch them, so they were with me. So this kind of represents that whole coming together of both worlds. But last night, as I laid in bed, I thought, yeah, that's my upbringing, and that's what kind of built my background. But what really has inspired and ignited me, and this is where I think I feel the passion. I'm going to show you some slides of kids, and I'll probably get choked up. This young man was in my high school and struggled with drugs and alcohol, and his senior year, or junior year, I think it was, his mom was a nurse in town and apparently had been dealing prescription pills, and somebody died. She went to prison. He was left with his very, very alcoholic, abusive dad and his 4-year-old daughter. He didn't come to school anymore. He had to protect his sister. He had to protect his sister, who was 4. And it was at that time that I reached out to him, and we developed a plan, an individual plan. Here's how this is going to work. This is what we're going to do to meet your graduation requirements. And one thing about me is I believe in programs, and I believe in tailoring programs to meet kids' needs, because every kid deserves a shot, and every kid deserves the best that we can give them. So Dalton's senior year, he graduated, joined the service, and was top of his class, and has went on to have a beautiful family and all kinds of honors in the military. The next student that I'm going to show was homeless, lived under a bridge. I didn't know that. He scored the highest of any of our kids on our state assessment in our high school, but the kid did nothing. Absolutely nothing. Teachers were frustrated. I couldn't figure out why. I knew he was pretty dirty. Over time, we talked, and he shared with me he was living under a bridge. His home life was not such that he could live there anymore, and he didn't have an option but to drop out of school. At that point, and you'll see, the funny thing was, I was the principal, and this kid reached out to me maybe a year or two ago, and he says, I'm not sure if I have the right person. I was trying to find this counselor, and I'm like, oh, I was the high school principal. And so he tells me the story about, even though he ended up dropping out of school and was homeless several times, it was what we did for him that caused him to go on and be successful. He's now an engineer, I believe, in Alaska. I hate to say this out loud, but I couldn't move him into my house, and I couldn't know that a kid was living under a bridge. And so we got him into my grandma's basement. And she lived right next door, and I bought him an airplane ticket to go be with family in Alaska, because that's what he needed to survive. So he stayed there for about a week. We helped him. I bought him that airplane ticket and hadn't heard from him since. And those are my first ever graduating kids of our alternative school. And I wanted to share this kid right here. He was the first male in his family to ever graduate from high school. And when he graduated, his dad was in the front row. And as I gave him his diploma, his dad sobbed out loud. And so, you know, those programs that we think don't impact kids, or they are not worth it because we're only reaching a few students, those few students matter. So for me, when I really laid in bed last night thinking about what ignites me, what sparks me, it's that. It's not my upbringing. It's really about what's happened since. And that's why, I know I'm getting choked up. That's why I fight for programs. And I fight for money to support our classrooms, because that's where the work is done. So that's my Ignite video.